The Last Shipment, a novel of the Clotilda, by Sylvester Sko Fourroux, Part 1, The Wager, Chapter 1, Spring 1859. The steamboat Southern Republic churned northward through the Alabama River, its paddle wheels slapping the brown water into foam that caught the late afternoon sun like scattered coins. Timothy Meaher stood on the upper deck, one boot propped on the railing, a cigar clenched between his teeth, watching the cypress trees slide past. He was a big man, thick through the chest and shoulders, with hands that had built ships and a face that had learned to show nothing it didn't want to show. Behind him, in the passenger salon, he could hear the voices rising again, that same damn argument that had been going on since they'd left Mobile that morning. Northern voices, mostly. Abolitionists, or at least sympathizers, heading up to Montgomery on business they claimed was purely commercial, but they couldn't keep their mouths shut about the slavery question. Couldn't let a man enjoy his whiskey and his cigar without turning everything into a moral crusade. The federal government has made its position clear, one of them was saying now, his Boston accent sharp as a knife. The international slave trade has been illegal for more than 50 years. Any man who engages in it is a criminal, subject to hanging. Meaher turned slowly, the cigar still in his teeth. Through the salon windows he could see them, 3 men in dark suits, one of them standing now, gesturing with his hands. The speaker was thin, with wire-rimmed spectacles and the kind of pale skin that burned in the Alabama sun. A lawyer, probably, or a banker. Someone who'd never built anything with his own hands, never risked anything more than money. "Is that so?" Meaher said, pushing through the door into the salon. The room fell quiet. Other passengers, planters, merchants, a few women in traveling clothes looked up from their cards and their newspapers. "The federal government says it's illegal, does it?" The thin man turned. "Mr. Meaher, I didn't realize you were listening." "Hard not to, the way you're carrying on." Meaher moved to the bar, poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon. "You were saying something about hanging." "I was merely stating a fact. The act prohibiting importation of slaves was passed in 1807. It's been the law of the land for more than half a century." "And yet," Meaher said, swirling the bourbon in his glass, "ships still sail. Cargo still arrives. Funny how that works." "Not in Mobile Bay, they don't." This from another of the Northerners, a younger man with mutton chop whiskers. "The federal patrols have made it impossible. No one would dare." "No one would dare?" Meaher laughed, a sound like gravel shifting. "Son, you don't know much about Mobile, do you? You don't know much about what men will dare when there's money to be made and a point to be proven." The thin man adjusted his spectacles. "Are you suggesting, sir, that you would violate federal law? That you would engage in the slave trade despite the penalties?" The salon had gone completely quiet now. Even the card players had stopped, their hands frozen above the table. Outside, the paddle wheel kept its rhythm, and somewhere a bell was ringing, marking the hour. Meaher took a long drink of his bourbon, felt it burn down his throat. He was thinking about his shipyard, about the vessels he'd built, about the fortune he'd made in timber and steamboats and the sweat of other men's labor. He was thinking about these northern bastards coming down here, telling him what he could and couldn't do, what was moral and what wasn't, as if they had any right to judge him. "I'm suggesting," he said slowly, "that your federal patrols aren't worth a damn. I'm suggesting that a man with the right ship and the right captain could bring a whole ship full of Africans right into Mobile Bay, right under the government's nose, and there's not a thing they could do to stop him." "That's preposterous," the thin man said. The patrols are lazy and corrupt, and half of them are drunk by noon." Meaher set his glass down hard on the bar. "I could do it tomorrow, if I wanted to. Hell, I could do it on a bet." The words hung in the air. Someone coughed. One of the women gathered her skirts and left the salon, her face tight with disapproval. The thin man was staring at him now, his eyes hard behind the spectacles. "A bet, Mr. Meaher?" "That's right. A bet. Mayer felt the anger rising in him now, hot and righteous. These people, coming down here, thinking they knew better, thinking they could tell him how to live. I'll bet you $1,000? No. Make it 2,000 that I can bring a ship full of slaves into Mobile Bay within the year, and your precious federal government won't do a damn thing about it. The salon erupted. Men were standing now, some shouting, some trying to calm things down. The thin man's face had gone red. You can't be serious. You're talking about human beings, about kidnapping and bondage, and I'm talking about property, Mia Hare said, and about proving a point. You people think you can come down here and tell us how to run our affairs, but you don't know a damn thing about the real world. You don't know what it takes to build something, to make something work. You just sit up there in your counting houses and your law offices and pass judgment. This is madness, the younger man said. You'd risk hanging just to prove a point? Maher smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I won't hang. That's the whole point. Your government is all talk and no action. They pass their laws and make their speeches, but when it comes down to it, they can't enforce a damn thing. Not down here, not in Mobile. He looked around the salon, at all the faces staring at him. Some shocked, some excited, some calculating. He knew what they were thinking. They were thinking about whether he'd really do it. They were thinking about the money, about the risk, about what it would mean if he succeeded. So what do you say? He asked the thin man. Do we have a bet? The man's mouth opened and closed. He looked at his companions, then back at Mir. This is unconscionable. I won't be party to self. That's what I thought. Maher picked up his glass again. All talk, just like your government. He turned and walked back out onto the deck, leaving the chaos behind him. The sun was lower now, painting the river gold and red. The trees cast long shadows across the water. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear a steamboat whistle. Lonely and long. He hadn't meant to say it. The words had just come out, fueled by bourbon and anger and pride. But now that they were out there, now that he'd said them in front of witnesses, he couldn't take them back. And the truth was, he didn't want to. The idea was already taking root in his mind, growing, spreading. A ship full of Africans, right into Mobile Bay, right under the government's nose. It could be done. He knew it could be done. He had the money, the connections, the knowledge of the coast. All he needed was the right ship and the right captain. Behind him, the door opened. He didn't turn around, but he knew who it was by the footsteps. His brother Burns, who'd been playing cards in the corner, who'd heard everything. Tim? Burns said quietly. Tell me you weren't serious. Why wouldn't I be serious? Because it's insane. Because it's illegal. Because if you get caught, they'll hang you. I won't get caught. Burns moved to stand beside him at the railing. He was younger than Timothy by 3 years, leaner, with a face that showed worry more easily. You're talking about going to Africa. About buying human beings and transporting them across the ocean. Do you have any idea what that involves? I have some idea. The patrols. The patrols are nothing. I've been watching them for years. They're predictable. They're lazy. A fast ship with a good captain could slip right past them. Burns was quiet for a moment, watching the river. You'd need a special kind of captain. Someone who knows ships, who knows the coast, who's willing to take the risk. I know. Someone who needs money badly enough to risk his neck. Timothy smiled. I know just the man. Chapter 2. Captain William Foster stood in the shipyard, watching the sun come up over Mobile Bay. The air was cool and damp, smelling of salt and sawdust and the creosote they used to treat the timber. Around him, the skeleton of a new steamboat rose against the pale sky, its ribs like the bones of some great beast. He was a tall man, lean and weathered, with hands scarred from years of working with wood and rope and iron. His face was angular, all planes and shadows, with eyes the color of the bay on a cloudy day. He'd been born in Nova Scotia 42 years ago, had learned shipbuilding from his father, had come south following the work and the money. He was good at what he did, better than good. The ships he built were fast and strong and beautiful, and men paid well for his skill. But skill didn't pay the debts. Skill didn't feed a family or keep a roof over their heads or stop the creditors from knocking at the door. "Captain Foster!" He turned. Timothy Mayer was walking across the yard, his boots crunching on the wood shavings. Even at this early hour, the man looked prosperous. Good coat, clean shirt, gold watch chain glinting in the morning light. "Mr. Mayer." Foster nodded. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about a conversation I had yesterday on the steamboat from Montgomery." Mayer stopped a few feet away, looking up at the unfinished vessel. "Fine work, as always. Thank you. How much do you owe, Foster?" The question was blunt, unexpected. Foster felt his jaw tighten. "I don't see how that's—" "How much?" Foster was quiet for a moment. Around them, the shipyard was starting to wake up. He could hear voices, the sound of hammers, the creak of ropes. "Enough," he said finally. "More than I can pay back anytime soon." "What if I told you I had a job for you? A special job. One that would pay enough to clear all your debts and leave you with money to spare. What kind of job?" Mayer smiled. "The kind that requires discretion and courage and a man who knows how to build a ship that can outrun anything on the water." Foster felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd heard rumors about Mayer, about the kinds of business he was involved in. Nothing proven, nothing that would stand up in court, but rumors nonetheless. "I'm a shipbuilder, Mr. Mayer, not a smuggler. I'm not asking you to smuggle. I'm asking you to sail. Sail where?" Mayer looked around, making sure no one was close enough to hear. "Africa. The Bight of Benin. There's a port there, Ouida, where certain transactions can be made. I need a captain who can make the voyage, conduct the business, and bring the cargo back safely." The cold in Foster's stomach spread. "You're talking about slaves." "I'm talking about property. Legal property. Once it's on American soil. The international slave trade has been illegal for 50 years. So I've been told." Mayer's voice was dry. "Repeatedly. By people who don't understand how the world actually works." Foster turned away, looking out at the bay. The water was calm this morning, reflecting the pink and gold of the sunrise. He thought about his wife, about his children, about the house they were about to lose. He thought about the debts that kept him awake at night, the creditors who were losing patience, the future that seemed to be closing in around him like a trap. "How much?" he asked quietly. "Enough to clear your debts twice over, plus a share of the profits when we sell the cargo. And if we're caught, we won't be caught. Not if you do your job right." Foster closed his eyes. He could feel the morning sun on his face, could hear the sounds of the shipyard, could smell the salt air. He thought about his father, about the lessons he'd learned as a boy in Nova Scotia, about honor and integrity and doing the right thing, about how a man's word was his bond and his reputation was everything. But reputation didn't feed children. Honor didn't pay debts. "I'll need a ship," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A fast one. Something that can carry cargo but still outrun the patrols. I have a ship. The Clotilda. 86 feet long, built for speed. She's yours to refit however you need. I'll need supplies. Food, water, chains, lumber for false decks. Whatever you need. And a crew. Men who can keep their mouths shut. I'll help you find them." Foster opened his eyes. The sun was higher now, burning off the morning mist. The bay stretched out before him, vast and empty and full of possibility. Or full of damnation. He wasn't sure which. "When?" he asked. "Soon. Within the year. I made a bet, you see. A foolish bet, perhaps, but one I intend to win." Foster turned to look at him. "A bet? With some northern gentlemen who think the federal government can actually enforce its laws down here. I told them I could bring a ship full of Africans right into Mobile Bay, right under their noses. I intend to prove it. You're risking people's lives over a bet? Miaher's face hardened. I'm risking my own life, and my fortune, and I'm offering you a chance to save yours. Whether you take it or not is up to you. They stood there in silence, two men in a shipyard at dawn, making a devil's bargain. Foster knew he should walk away. He knew he should tell Miar to go to hell, to find another captain, to take his blood money somewhere else. But he also knew he couldn't. The debts were too large, the need too great, the trap too tight. I'll do it, he said. God help me, I'll do it. Miaher smiled and extended his hand. Then we have an agreement. Foster looked at the hand for a long moment before taking it. The handshake was firm, businesslike, sealing a deal that would change everything. That would send him across an ocean to buy human beings and bring them back in chains. That would make him a criminal and a slaver and something he'd never thought he'd become. One condition, Foster said, not releasing Mayar's hand. When this is over, when the cargo is delivered and the debts are paid, I'm done. I never want to hear about this again. I never want to see you again. We're finished. Agreed. They released hands. Miaher turned to go, then paused. You'll want to start the refitting soon. Winter's coming, and we'll need to sail by early spring. I'll have my brothers James and Burns help with the planning. They're invested in this too. Your brothers know? Family business, Captain. We Mayhers stick together. After he was gone, Foster stood alone in the shipyard, watching the workers arrive, watching the day begin. His hands were shaking. He clenched them into fists, trying to stop the trembling, but it wouldn't stop. He thought about what he'd just agreed to, about the voyage ahead, about the cargo he'd be carrying. Not cargo. People. Human beings. He thought about them now. Whoever they were, wherever they were, living their lives in Africa, not knowing that their world was about to end, not knowing that a ship was being prepared, that a captain had been hired, that their freedom was about to be stolen. He thought about his own children, safe in their beds. He thought about what he would tell them someday, if they ever asked what he'd done to save the family, what he'd done to keep them fed and clothed and housed. He thought about whether he'd be able to tell them the truth. The sun was fully up now, bright and warm. It was going to be a beautiful day. Foster turned back to the unfinished steamboat, to the work that needed to be done. He had a ship to build, and after that, he had a voyage to make. God help him. God help them all. Chapter 3. Winter 1859 to 1860. The work began in November, when the weather turned cold and the bay took on the gray color of old iron. Foster worked mostly at night, when the shipyard was empty and no one could see what he was doing to the Clotilda. He'd sent most of his regular crew away, keeping only a few men he trusted, or at least men who needed money badly enough not to ask questions. The ship was a schooner, sleek and fast, built for coastal trade. 86 feet from stem to stern, with 2 masts and a shallow draft that would let her navigate rivers and inlets. She was beautiful, in her way. Foster had always appreciated the lines of a well-built vessel, the way the hull curved, the way the masts rose against the sky. But now, as he worked to transform her into a slaver, he found it hard to see the beauty. The modifications were extensive. He built a false deck below the main one, creating a space barely 4 feet high where the cargo would be kept. He installed iron rings along the beams for chains. He reinforced the hatches so they could be locked from the outside. He added extra water barrels and storage for provisions: rice, beans, dried fish, vinegar for treating the water to keep it from going bad. James Miaher came by most nights to check on the progress. He was quieter than his brother Timothy, more thoughtful, but just as committed to the venture. He brought supplies, helped with the heavy work, asked questions about the voyage. "How long will it take?" he asked one night, watching Foster install a new hatch cover. 6 weeks to Africa, if the weather's good. Maybe longer if it's not. Then however long it takes to conduct the business. Then 6 weeks back. And the cargo? How many can she carry? Foster's hands stilled on the hammer. I don't know. 100, maybe. Maybe more if we pack them tight. Pack them tight. James repeated the words slowly, as if tasting them. That's what we're doing, isn't it? Packing human beings like cargo. Foster looked at him. Having second thoughts? No. Yes. I don't know. James ran a hand through his hair. Timothy's so sure about this, so confident, but I keep thinking about what we're doing, about what it means. Then why are you here? Because he's my brother. Because we're in this together. Because... He trailed off, shaking his head. I don't know. Maybe I'm trying to convince myself it's not as bad as it seems. It's worse, Foster said quietly. It's worse than you can imagine. You've done this before? No, but I've heard stories. From other captains, other sailors, about the Middle Passage, about what happens on those ships. About the people who die, the ones who go mad, the ones who throw themselves overboard rather than face what's coming. James was quiet for a long time. We could stop. We could tell Timothy we've changed our minds. Could we? No, probably not. They worked in silence after that. The only sounds, the hammer and the saw and the wind whistling through the rigging. Foster thought about his own brother, back in Nova Scotia, who'd stayed in the family business, who'd never left home, who'd never had to make choices like this. He wondered what his brother would think of him now. He wondered if he'd ever be able to go home again. By January, the Clotilda was ready. She sat low in the water, her hull freshly painted, her masts tall and straight. To anyone who didn't know better, she looked like any other coastal trader. But Foster knew what she really was. He knew what she'd been built to do. Timothy Meaher came to inspect her on a cold morning when frost covered the deck. He walked the length of the ship, examining everything, asking questions, nodding his approval. Fine work, Captain. She'll do nicely. She'll do what you're paying her to do, Foster said. Whether that's fine or not is another question. Meaher looked at him sharply. Having doubts? I've had doubts since the beginning. But I gave you my word, and I'll keep it. Good, because we sail in March. I've made the arrangements in Africa. There's a man in Ouida, a trader, who'll have the cargo ready. All you have to do is get there, make the purchase, and bring them back. All I have to do. Foster laughed, but there was no humor in it. You make it sound simple. It is simple. You sail to Africa, you buy slaves, you bring them back. Men have been doing it for centuries, and it's been illegal for 50 years. Only if you get caught. Meaher pulled out a leather pouch, heavy with coins. Here's the gold. $9,000. That should be enough to purchase 100 or more, depending on the market. Keep careful records. I'll want an accounting when you return. Foster took the pouch, feeling its weight. $9,000 in gold. Enough to buy 100 human lives. Enough to damn his soul forever. There's one more thing, Meaher said. I'm sending my brother Burns with you. He'll represent the family interests, make sure everything goes according to plan. I don't need a passenger. He's not a passenger. He's a partner. And he's going. Foster wanted to argue, but he knew it was pointless. The Meahers didn't trust him. Not completely. They wanted their own man on board, watching, reporting back. He couldn't blame them. He didn't trust himself either. The weeks before departure passed in a blur. Foster hired a crew, young men, mostly, who needed money and didn't ask too many questions. Among them was a sailor named Thomas, barely 20 years old, with a Boston accent and eyes that still held some innocence. Foster almost turned him away, thinking he was too young, too soft for what was coming. But the boy was a good sailor, and they needed hands. You know what this voyage is about? Foster asked him during the interview. I've heard rumors, sir. And you're still willing to go? Thomas hesitated. I need the money, sir. My mother's sick, and the doctors are expensive. I'll do whatever work needs doing. Foster looked at him for a long moment, seeing something of himself in the young man's face. The desperation, the need, the willingness to compromise for the sake of survival. All right, you're hired. But understand this, what we're about to do is illegal. If we're caught, we'll hang. All of us. I understand, sir. I don't think you do. But you will. The night before they sailed, Foster went home to his family. His wife knew something was wrong, she'd known for months, but she didn't ask questions. She just held him, her face pressed against his chest, her tears soaking through his shirt. "Come back to me," she whispered. "Whatever you're doing, wherever you're going, just come back." "I will," he promised. "I'll come back, and everything will be better. The debts will be paid, and we'll have a fresh start." "I don't care about the debts, I care about you." He held her tighter, breathing in the smell of her hair, trying to memorize this moment. The warmth of her body, the sound of her breathing, the feeling of being home. He knew it might be the last time. He knew that the man who came back from this voyage, if he came back at all, might not be the same man who left. His children were asleep. He went to their rooms, stood over their beds, watched them dream. They looked so peaceful, so innocent. He wanted to wake them, to tell them he loved them, to explain why he was doing this. But he couldn't find the words. How do you explain to a child that you're about to become a monster? How do you justify the unjustifiable? He left before dawn, walking through the dark streets to the shipyard. The Clotilda was waiting, her sails furled, her deck empty. The crew would arrive soon, and then they'd cast off, slipping out of Mobile Bay under cover of darkness. Burns Meaher was already on board, checking the supplies. He nodded to Foster but didn't speak. There was nothing to say. They both knew what they were about to do. As the sun rose, painting the sky red and gold, Foster stood at the helm and gave the order to cast off. The Clotilda moved slowly at first, then faster as the sails caught the wind. Mobile Bay spread out before them, vast and empty. Beyond it lay the Gulf of Mexico, and beyond that, the Atlantic Ocean, and beyond that, Africa. Foster looked back at the shore, at the city disappearing behind them, at the life he was leaving. He thought about his wife, his children, his home. He thought about the man he used to be, before the debts, before the desperation, before Timothy Meaher and his damned bet. He thought about the people he was going to buy, the people whose lives he was about to destroy, and he thought about whether there was any way back from what he was about to do. The wind filled the sails, and the Clotilda picked up speed, cutting through the water like a knife. Behind them, the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist. Ahead, the ocean stretched to the horizon, dark and endless. Foster gripped the wheel and set his course for Africa. Part 2. West Africa. Chapter 4. Bantay Region, West Africa. April 1860. Oluwale Kosola woke before dawn, as he always did, to the sound of roosters crowing and his mother moving about the compound. He lay on his sleeping mat for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of morning, the soft voices of women starting their cooking fires, the bleating of goats, the rustle of palm fronds in the breeze. Through the doorway of his family's dwelling, he could see the sky beginning to lighten, turning from black to deep blue to the pale gray that came just before sunrise. He was 19 years old, tall and strong, with the kind of body that came from years of working in the fields and training with the other young men of the village. His skin was dark and smooth, his eyes bright with intelligence and curiosity. In a few months, he would undergo the initiation ceremony that would make him a full man in the eyes of his people. He would receive his marks, learn the sacred knowledge, take his place among the warriors and farmers and leaders of Bantay. He was thinking about this as he rose from his mat, wrapped his cloth around his waist, and stepped out into the compound. His mother was already at the fire, stirring a pot of yam porridge. She looked up and smiled when she saw him. "You're awake early, my son." "I couldn't sleep. Too much excitement. About the festival." "About everything." He squatted beside her, warming his hands over the fire. "About the initiation. About the future, about what kind of man I'll become. His mother reached out and touched his face, her hand gentle. You'll become a good man, a strong man, like your father. Oluwale's father had died 3 years ago, taken by a fever that swept through the village. He'd been a farmer and a storyteller, respected by everyone, known for his wisdom and his kindness. Oluwale still missed him, still felt the absence like a wound that wouldn't quite heal. I hope so, he said quietly. I know so. His mother went back to stirring the porridge. Now go wash. The day is beginning, and there's work to be done. Oluwale walked to the stream that ran through the village, following the path he'd walked 1,000 times before. The air was cool and damp, smelling of earth and growing things. Around him, the village was waking up children running between the compounds, women carrying water jars on their heads, men heading out to the fields with their tools. This was his world. These were his people. The Yoruba of Bante, living as they had lived for generations, farming the rich soil, raising their families, honoring their ancestors and their gods. It was a good life, Oluwale thought. A life of hard work and simple pleasures, of community and tradition, of knowing your place in the world and being content with it. At the stream, he found his friend Abile already there, splashing water on his face. Abile was a year older than Oluwale, broader in the shoulders, with a laugh that could be heard across the village. He was engaged to be married to a girl named Adesuwa, and the wedding would take place after the harvest. Brother, Abile called out when he saw Oluwale. You're late. I've been waiting for you. Late? The sun isn't even up yet. Exactly. We should have been in the fields an hour ago. Abile grinned, showing white teeth. Or maybe we should skip the fields entirely and go hunting instead. I saw tracks yesterday, near the big baobab tree. Antelope, I think. You know, we can't skip the fields. Not with the festival coming. Everyone needs to help with the harvest. Always so responsible. Abele splashed water at him. That's why you'll make a good elder someday. Boring but good. They washed together, talking about the festival, about the initiation, about Abile's upcoming wedding. The conversation was easy, comfortable, the kind of talk that comes from a lifetime of friendship. They'd grown up together, learned to farm together, trained as warriors together. They were closer than brothers. As they walked back to the village, the sun finally broke over the horizon, flooding the world with golden light. The fields stretched out before them, green and lush, the yam plants heavy with tubers, the corn stalks tall and strong. It would be a good harvest this year. The rains had come at the right time, and the soil was rich. There would be plenty of food for the festival, plenty to store for the dry season. Oluwale felt a surge of contentment as he looked at the fields, at the village, at the life he knew. This was where he belonged. This was where he would live and work and raise his own family someday. This was home. He didn't know that in less than a week, it would all be gone. In another part of the village, a young girl named Ridoshi was helping her mother grind cassava. She was small for her age, barely 12, with quick hands and a serious face. She worked carefully, using the stone mortar and pestle the way her mother had taught her, pounding the cassava root into flour that would be used to make fufu. Her mother watched her work, nodding approval. Good. You're learning well. Soon you'll be ready to manage your own household. Ridoshi didn't want to manage her own household. She wanted to keep living here, with her mother and father and younger siblings, in the compound where she'd been born. But she knew that wasn't how things worked. Girls grew up, got married, moved to their husbands' compounds. That was the way of things. Mother, she said, still pounding the cassava, when I'm married, will I still be able to visit you? Of course, child. You'll always be my daughter, no matter where you live. And will you teach my daughters to grind cassava the way you taught me? Her mother smiled. If the gods will it, yes. I'll teach your daughters everything I know. Ridoshi felt better hearing this. The future seemed less frightening when she thought about it that way, not as an ending, but as a continuation. She would have her own family, but she would still be connected to this one. The thread would remain unbroken. She didn't know that the thread was about to be cut, that in less than a week, she would be torn from her mother's arms and dragged away in chains. That she would never see this compound again, never grind cassava with her mother again, never have the chance to teach her own daughters the things she'd learned. She didn't know that her childhood was about to end in the most brutal way possible. Kupoli was nursing her youngest child when she heard the drums. At first, she thought it was just the usual morning rhythm, the drummers calling people to work or announcing some minor news. But then she heard the pattern change, becoming urgent, insistent, a warning. She stood quickly, the baby still at her breast, and went to the doorway of her dwelling. Other women were emerging from their compounds, looking around, trying to understand what the drums were saying. "What is it?" her neighbor called out. "What's happening?" Before anyone could answer, they heard the screams. They came from the edge of the village, high and terrified, cutting through the morning air like knives. Kupoli's blood went cold. She clutched her baby tighter, her heart pounding. Around her, people were running now, some toward the screams, some away, everyone confused and frightened. Then she saw them. Warriors. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, pouring into the village from all sides. They wore red cloth and carried guns and machetes. Their faces were painted, their eyes hard and merciless. They moved with terrible efficiency, surrounding compounds, grabbing people, striking down anyone who resisted. Dahomey warriors. The slave raiders from the kingdom to the west. Kupoli turned and ran, still holding her baby, trying to get to her other children. But the warriors were everywhere. She saw her neighbor cut down, saw a young man she'd known since childhood clubbed to the ground, saw children being torn from their mother's arms. She ran toward her compound, screaming her children's names. But before she could reach them, strong hands grabbed her from behind. She fought, kicking and biting, trying to hold on to her baby. But there were too many of them, too strong. They ripped the infant from her arms, and she heard herself screaming, a sound she didn't recognize as her own voice. The baby was crying, reaching for her. She lunged toward the sound, but someone hit her, hard, across the face. She fell, tasting blood. When she tried to get up, they hit her again. The last thing she saw before darkness took her was her baby, lying on the ground, crying for her. Oluwale was in the fields when he heard the drums. He looked up, confused, trying to understand the pattern. Beside him, Abele had gone still, his face suddenly pale. "Run," Abile said. "We have to run." "What?" "Why, Dahomey, it's a raid. Run!" They dropped their tools and ran, sprinting toward the village. But even from a distance, Oluwale could see the smoke rising, could hear the screams. His heart was pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. They were almost to the village when the warriors found them. They came out of the bush on both sides, surrounding them, cutting off any escape. Oluwale tried to fight, throwing punches, kicking, using every technique he'd learned in his warrior training. But they had guns and machetes, and he had nothing but his fists. He saw Abile go down, blood streaming from a cut on his head. He tried to reach him, but someone grabbed him from behind, twisting his arms back so hard he thought they would break. He felt rope being tied around his wrists, felt a noose being slipped around his neck. "No!" he screamed. "No! Let me go!" But they didn't let him go. They dragged him forward, adding him to a line of other captives, men, women, children, all tied together by ropes around their necks. He could see his village burning now, could see bodies lying in the dirt, could hear the wailing of the survivors. His mother. Where was his mother? He tried to look back, tried to see if she was among the captives or among the dead. But the warriors pushed him forward, forcing him to walk. The rope around his neck was tight, choking him. Behind him, someone was crying. Ahead of him, someone was praying. They walked for hours, leaving the village behind, leaving everything Oluwale had ever known. The sun climbed higher, beating down on them mercilessly. People stumbled and fell, and when they did, the warriors beat them until they got up again. An old man collapsed and didn't get up. The warriors cut him loose and left him lying in the dirt. Oluwale's mind was reeling, trying to understand what had happened. This morning, he'd been thinking about the festival, about his initiation, about the future. Now he was a captive, being marched away from his home toward some unknown fate. He thought about his mother, about whether she was alive or dead. He thought about his friends, his neighbors, his village. He thought about the life he'd been planning, the man he was supposed to become. All of it was gone. In the space of a few hours, his entire world had been destroyed. They walked until nightfall, then stopped in a clearing. The warriors built fires and ate, but they gave the captives nothing. Oluwale sat with his back against a tree, the rope still around his neck, his wrists raw and bleeding from the bonds. Around him, people were weeping quietly, too exhausted and traumatized to make much noise. Abele was nearby, his head wound still bleeding. Their eyes met, and Oluwale saw his own despair reflected there. "What's going to happen to us?" Abil whispered. Oluwale didn't answer. He didn't know. But he had heard stories, whispered tales about the slave trade, about people being taken to the coast and sold to white men who came in ships. He had never believed those stories. They seemed too horrible to be true. Now he knew they were true. Now he knew he was living them. Chapter 5. The march to Abomi took 3 days. 3 days of walking in the brutal sun, of sleeping on the ground with ropes around their necks, of watching people die and being unable to help them. By the time they reached the capital of the Dahomey kingdom, Oluwale had lost count of how many captives had fallen and been left behind. Abomi was larger than any place Oluwale had ever seen. The walls were high and thick, decorated with skulls and bones, the remains of enemies defeated in battle. Inside, the streets were crowded with people, markets, soldiers. The captives were marched through the city like a parade, while people stopped to stare at them, to point and laugh and sometimes spit. They were taken to a large compound near the palace, where other captives were already being held. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all from different villages, all with the same look of shock and despair. The warriors untied the ropes connecting them but left their hands bound. They were pushed into a large open area surrounded by high walls. Oluwale found a spot against the wall and sank down, his legs finally giving out. His feet were bleeding, his throat was raw from thirst, his head was pounding. Around him, people were crying, praying, calling out names of loved ones they'd been separated from. "Water?" someone croaked. "Please, water?" The guards brought water eventually, but not enough. They brought food too thin gruel that tasted like nothing, but again, not enough. People fought over it, desperate and starving. Oluwale managed to get a few sips of water and a handful of gruel. It wasn't enough to satisfy his hunger, but it was enough to keep him alive. That night, lying on the hard ground, he heard singing, soft at first, then growing stronger. Someone was singing a song from home, a song about the ancestors, about the spirits that watched over the living. Other voices joined in, creating a harmony that rose into the night sky. Oluwale found himself singing too, the words coming automatically, connecting him to something larger than his own suffering. For a few minutes, he wasn't a captive in a strange city. He was a Yoruba man, singing the songs of his people, keeping the traditions alive. When the song ended, there was silence. Then someone else started a different song, and the cycle began again. They stayed in Abomi for a week. During that time, more captives arrived, people from other villages, other raids. The compound became more and more crowded, the conditions worse and worse. People got sick. Some died. The guards dragged the bodies away without ceremony. Oluwale tried to keep track of the people from his village. He found Abile, still alive despite his head wound. He found Radoshi, the young girl who'd been grinding cassava with her mother. She was huddled in a corner, her eyes empty, not responding when he spoke to her. He found Kupali, the woman with the baby. She was alive, but something in her had broken. She sat rocking back and forth, her arms cradling an invisible child, singing a lullaby to no one. He didn't find his mother. He asked everyone from Bonte, but no one had seen her. Either she was dead, or she'd been taken somewhere else, or she'd escaped. He didn't know which possibility was worse. On the 8th day, they were marched out of Abomi, heading south toward the coast. This march was longer than the first one, 4 days through dense forest and open savanna, through villages that watched them pass with a mixture of pity and fear. The sun was merciless, and the pace was brutal. More people died. More bodies were left behind. Oluwale walked in a daze, his mind disconnected from his body. He thought about his village, about the fields he'd worked, about the stream where he'd washed with Abele. He thought about the initiation ceremony he would never have, about the man he would never become. He thought about his mother, about whether she was thinking of him, about whether she knew he was still alive. He thought about death, about how easy it would be to just stop walking, to let the guards beat him, to let go of life. But something kept him moving. Some stubborn core of survival, some refusal to give up. He didn't know why. He didn't know what he was surviving for, but he kept walking. On the 4th day, they smelled the ocean. Chapter 6. Ouida was a city of slaves. That was Oluwale's first thought when they arrived. Everywhere he looked, he saw captives in pens, in chains, being marched through the streets, being examined by white men in strange clothes. The air smelled of salt and sweat and human waste. The sound was a constant murmur of voices in dozens of languages, punctuated by the crack of whips and the rattle of chains. They were taken to a barracoon, a large wooden structure near the beach, surrounded by high walls. Inside, the space was divided into sections, each packed with captives. The guards pushed Oluwale and the others from Bonte into one of these sections, then locked the gate behind them. The barracoon was worse than the compound in Abomi. It was smaller, more crowded, hotter. The roof was low, making it hard to stand upright. There were no windows, just small gaps between the wooden slats that let in slivers of light and air. The floor was dirt, already soaked with urine, and worse. Oluwale found a spot near one of the walls and sat down, pulling his knees to his chest. Around him, people were talking in low voices, trying to understand what was happening, where they were going, what would become of them. "They're going to sell us," someone said. "To the white men. We're going across the ocean." "Across the ocean? That's impossible. No one can cross the ocean. The white men can. They have big ships. They take people to a place called America." "What's America?" "I don't know, but I heard it's far away. So far you can never come back." Oluwale listened to these conversations, trying to make sense of them. America, ships, the ocean. None of it seemed real. How could you cross the ocean? How could there be a place so far away you could never return? But he'd also thought it was impossible for his village to be destroyed, for him to be captured, for his entire life to be torn apart in a single morning. He'd learned that impossible things happened all the time. They stayed in the barracoon for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of heat and hunger and fear. The guards brought food once a day, rice and beans, barely enough to keep them alive. They brought water twice a day, in buckets that everyone had to share. People got sick. Dysentery swept through the barracoon, leaving people weak and dehydrated. Some died. The guards dragged the bodies out and threw them in a pit somewhere. Oluwale tried to keep his strength up, tried to eat and drink when he could, tried to stay alert. He talked to the other captives, learning their stories, their names, where they came from. He found that it helped, somehow, to know he wasn't alone, that all of these people were suffering the same fate, enduring the same nightmare. He became friends with a man named Goompa, older than him by 10 years, who'd been a farmer in a village near the coast. Gumpa had been captured with his wife and 2 children, but they'd been separated in Abomey. He didn't know where they were now, didn't know if they were alive or dead. "I keep thinking I'll see them," Gumpa said one night, his voice hoarse. "Every time new captives arrive, I look for their faces, but they're never there." "Maybe they escaped," Oluwale said, though he didn't believe it. "Maybe. Or maybe they're dead. Or maybe they're in another barracoon, waiting to be sold to different white men, going to a different place." Gumpa laughed bitterly. "I don't know which would be worse." Oluwale thought about his mother again. He'd been thinking about her constantly, wondering, hoping, fearing. "At least if they're alive, there's hope," he said. "As long as we're alive, there's hope." Hope for what? Oluwale didn't have an answer. On the 21st day, the white men came. There were 3 of them, accompanied by African traders and guards. They walked through the barracoon, examining the captives like livestock, checking teeth and muscles, looking for signs of disease or weakness. They spoke in a language Oluwale had never heard before, harsh and guttural. One of them stopped in front of Oluwale. He was tall and lean, with weathered skin and gray eyes. He looked tired, Oluwale thought. Tired and sad and somehow ashamed. The man stared at him for a long moment, then said something to the traders. They nodded and made a mark on a piece of paper. The man moved on, examining others. Abile, Redoshi, Kupali, Gumpa. One by one, they were marked down, selected, purchased. The process took hours. By the end of it, 110 people had been chosen. The white men paid the traders. Oluwale saw gold changing hands, saw the traders counting coins and smiling. Then the selected captives were separated from the others, taken out of the barracoon, marched down to the beach. Oluwale had never seen the ocean before. It stretched out before him, vast and blue and terrifying, going on forever. The waves crashed against the shore, loud as thunder. The wind was strong, carrying the smell of salt and seaweed. And there, anchored offshore, was the ship. It was smaller than Oluwale had expected, just a wooden vessel with 2 tall masts and white sails. But it looked solid, seaworthy, built to cross that impossible distance. Small boats were waiting on the beach, ready to ferry the captives out to the ship. The guards began loading people into the boats, 10 or 12 at a time. Oluwale watched as the first boat pushed off, watched it bob across the waves toward the ship. He watched as the captives were hauled aboard, disappearing into the vessel's dark interior. Then it was his turn. The guards pushed him toward a boat, forced him to climb in. The boat rocked beneath him, unstable and frightening. He'd never been on water before, had never felt this sensation of movement beneath his feet. The boat pushed off, and suddenly they were moving across the waves, rising and falling with each swell. Oluwale gripped the sides, his knuckles white, his stomach churning. Around him, others were crying, praying, calling out to gods and ancestors. The ship loomed larger as they approached. Up close, it was massive, its wooden hull rising high above the water. A rope ladder hung down the side. The guards gestured for them to climb. Oluwale climbed, his hands shaking, his legs weak. The ladder swayed with each movement, threatening to throw him into the water. But he kept climbing, one rung at a time, until hands reached down and hauled him over the railing onto the deck. He stood there for a moment, looking around. The deck was crowded with sailors, all white men, all staring at the captives with expressions ranging from curiosity to disgust to pity. One of them, a young man with a kind face, met Oluwale's eyes and quickly looked away, as if ashamed. Then the guards were pushing him again, forcing him toward an opening in the deck, a hatch, leading down into darkness. He tried to resist, but they were too strong. They shoved him forward, and he fell, tumbling down into the ship's hold. He landed hard on wooden planks, the breath knocked out of him. Around him, he could hear others falling, crying out, scrambling in the darkness. The air was thick and hot, smelling of tar and timber and fear. As his eyes adjusted, he could see the space they were in. It was low, barely 4 feet high, forcing everyone to crouch or sit. Iron rings were bolted to the beams. Chains lay coiled on the floor, waiting. More captives were being pushed down through the hatch. Abaya landed near him, then Radoshi, then others. They huddled together in the darkness, trying to understand what was happening. Above them, Oluwale could hear shouting, the sound of the boats going back and forth, bringing more captives. The hold was filling up, becoming more and more crowded. People were being chained together, wrist to wrist, ankle to ankle. Then he heard a different sound, a mechanical sound, rhythmic and loud. It took him a moment to realize what it was. The anchor being raised, they were leaving Africa, leaving everything they'd ever known. Oluwale pressed his face against the wooden hull, trying to see through the gaps between the planks. He could see slivers of light, glimpses of water, the shore receding in the distance. He thought about his village, about his mother, about the life he'd lost. He thought about the man he was supposed to become, about the initiation ceremony that would never happen, about the future that had been stolen from him. And he thought about the ocean, about the impossible distance they were about to cross, about the unknown place called America that waited on the other side. The ship began to move, rocking gently at first, then more forcefully as it caught the wind. In the darkness of the hold, people were crying, praying, calling out names of loved ones left behind. Oluwale closed his eyes and began to sing, softly at first, then louder. The song his mother had taught him, the song about the ancestors, about the spirits that watched over the living. Other voices joined his. In the darkness, in the horror, in the beginning of their long nightmare, they sang together, and the ship sailed on, carrying them away from everything they'd ever known, toward a future they couldn't imagine. Part 3. The Middle Passage. Chapter 7. Captain William Foster stood on the deck of the Clotilda, watching the coast of Africa disappear behind them. The sun was setting, painting the sky red and gold, the same colors as the blood and gold that had bought the cargo now chained in his hold. He felt sick to his stomach, but he couldn't tell if it was from the motion of the ship or from what he'd just done. 110 people. He'd purchased 110 human beings for $9,000 in gold, $82 per person, give or take, less than the cost of a good horse back in Mobile. He'd tried to buy 125, but the patrol ships had appeared on the horizon while they were still loading. He'd had to make a choice, wait for the last 15 captives and risk being caught, or abandon them and sail immediately. He'd chosen to sail. Those 15 people were still on the beach, still in chains, waiting for a ship that would never come back for them. He told himself it was the right decision, that getting caught would have meant death for everyone, the crew, the captives already on board, himself. That saving 110 was better than saving none. But he couldn't stop thinking about those 15 faces, watching from the shore as the Clotilda sailed away. Captain. He turned. Thomas, the young sailor from Boston, was standing behind him. The boy looked pale, his eyes red-rimmed. He'd been crying, Foster realized. Or trying not to. What is it, Thomas? Sir, the people below, they need water and air. It's so hot down there, and they're packed so tight, and I know what it's like down there. Then why? Thomas stopped himself, swallowed hard. Sir, with respect, we have to do something. They're suffering. They're cargo, Thomas. They're supposed to suffer. That's how this works. Even as he said the words, Foster hated himself for them. But what else could he say? That he agreed with the boy? That he was disgusted by what they were doing? That he wished he'd never agreed to this voyage? Thomas was staring at him, his young face full of confusion and horror. Cargo? Sir, they're people, human beings. They have names and families and... I know what they are! Foster's voice came out harsher than he intended. He took a breath, trying to calm himself. Listen to me, Thomas. I know this is hard. I know it seems wrong, but we're committed now. We're at sea, and we have a job to do. The best thing we can do for those people is get them across the ocean as quickly and safely as possible. Safely? Sir, there's a girl down there who can't be more than 12 years old. She's chained to a woman who won't stop crying. There's a man with a head wound that's infected. There's... Enough. Foster held up his hand. I'll see to it that they get water, and we'll open the hatches during the day, let them come up on deck in shifts for air. But that's all I can do. That's all any of us can do. Thomas looked like he wanted to argue, but he just nodded and walked away. Foster watched him go, seeing the boy's shoulders slumped, his steps heavy. He was learning, Foster thought. Learning what it meant to compromise your principles for money. Learning what it cost to survive in a world that didn't care about right and wrong. Burns Mere emerged from the captain's cabin, looking green around the gills. He'd been seasick since they left Ouida, barely able to keep anything down. How long until we reach Mobile? He asked, his voice weak. 6 weeks if the weather holds. Maybe longer if it doesn't. 6 weeks, Burns groaned. I don't know if I can last 6 weeks. You'll last. You don't have a choice. Burns leaned against the railing, looking out at the darkening ocean. Do you ever think about what we're doing, Foster? About what it means? How? Every minute of every day. And I try not to think about it too much, because if I do, I'll go mad. They stood in silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the ship, the creak of the rigging, the slap of the waves against the hull, and underneath it all, the muffled sounds from below. Crying, praying, singing. They sing, Burns said quietly. Even down there, in those conditions, they sing. How is that possible? Foster didn't answer. He didn't know how it was possible. He didn't know how anyone could find the strength to sing in the midst of such suffering. But they did. Every night, he heard their voices rising from the hold. Songs in languages he didn't understand. Melodies that were both beautiful and heartbreaking. I'm going to check the cargo, he said finally. Make sure they're secured for the night. He climbed down the ladder into the hold, carrying a lantern. The smell hit him first, sweat and urine and fear, so thick it was almost solid. Then the heat, oppressive and suffocating. Then the sounds, breathing, crying, the rattle of chains. The captives were packed tight, sitting or lying in rows, chained wrist to wrist and ankle to ankle. There was barely room to move. The ceiling was so low that Foster had to crouch as he walked between them. He moved through the hold, checking the chains, making sure no one had managed to work themselves free. As he passed, faces turned toward him, some angry, some pleading, some empty of all expression. He tried not to look at them, tried to see them as cargo, as Timothy Meaher had said, but he couldn't. Every face was a person. Every person was someone's child, someone's parent, someone's friend. He stopped near a young man who was staring at him with fierce, intelligent eyes. There was something about this one, Foster thought. A strength, a dignity that even chains couldn't diminish. The young man said something in his own language, the words sharp and clear. I don't understand, Foster said. The young man said it again, louder this time. Other captives were looking now, listening. Some of them nodded, as if agreeing with whatever he was saying. Foster moved on, finishing his inspection. Everything was secure. The chains were holding. The captives weren't going anywhere. As he climbed back up to the deck, he heard the singing start again. That same young man's voice, leading the others. The melody was different this time, not sad, but defiant. A song of resistance, of refusal to be broken. Foster stood at the top of the ladder, listening, and despite everything, despite the horror of what he was doing, he felt something like admiration for these people, for their strength, their resilience, their refusal to give up their humanity even when everything had been taken from them. He thought about Thomas, about the boy's horror and confusion. He thought about himself at that age. about the man he used to be before the debts, and the desperation, and the compromises. He thought about whether there was any way back to being that man. The singing continued, rising into the night. Foster closed the hatch and locked it, sealing the captives in darkness. Then he went to his cabin, poured himself a drink, and tried not to think about what he'd become. Chapter 8. The first 2 weeks were the worst. Oyuale had thought nothing could be worse than the barracoon in Ouida, but he'd been wrong. The ship's hold was smaller, hotter, more crowded. The ceiling was so low he couldn't stand upright. The chains were so tight they cut into his wrists and ankles. And the motion, the constant rocking and pitching of the ship made him sick in a way he'd never experienced before. Around him, others were suffering the same way. People vomited, unable to keep down the meager rations of food and water. The smell became unbearable. The heat was suffocating. And for the first 13 days, they were kept in complete darkness, the hatches sealed, no light or fresh air reaching them. Oluwale lost track of time. Without the sun, without any way to mark the passage of days, everything blurred together into one long nightmare. He slept when exhaustion overtook him. He woke when the guards came with food and water. He existed in a state between consciousness and unconsciousness, his mind retreating to protect itself from the horror, but he didn't stop singing. Every day, sometimes multiple times a day, he would start a song, usually one from home, one his mother had taught him, one that connected him to his people and his past. At first, only a few voices joined him, but gradually, more and more people began to sing along. Even those who didn't know the words would hum the melody, adding their voices to the chorus. The singing helped. It gave them something to focus on besides the suffering. It reminded them that they were still human, still alive, still capable of creating beauty even in the midst of horror. It connected them to each other, creating a community in the darkness. Oluwale found himself becoming a leader, though he'd never sought the role. People looked to him for strength, for hope, for guidance. When someone was despairing, he would talk to them, encourage them, remind them to hold on. When someone was sick, he would share his water ration, even though he was desperately thirsty himself. When someone died, and people did die, their bodies going still in the darkness, he would lead the others in singing them to the ancestors. On the 13th day, the hatches opened. The light was blinding after so long in darkness. Oluwale squeezed his eyes shut, tears streaming down his face. Around him, others were crying out, covering their faces, overwhelmed by the sudden brightness. Gradually, his eyes adjusted. He could see the hold now, could see the faces of the people chained around him. They looked terrible, gaunt, filthy, sick. He wondered if he looked the same. The guards came down and began unchaining people, bringing them up on deck in small groups. When it was Oluwale's turn, he could barely walk. His legs had gone weak from sitting for so long, and the chains had rubbed his ankles raw. But he forced himself to climb the ladder, to emerge into the light and air. The deck was overwhelming. The sky was so vast, so blue. The ocean stretched in every direction, endless and terrifying. The wind was strong, carrying the smell of salt and freedom. Oluwale stood there, breathing deeply, feeling the sun on his face, trying to remember what it felt like to be human. The guards gave them water, not much, but more than they'd been getting below. They gave them vinegar-treated water to drink, which tasted terrible but was supposed to keep them from getting sick. They let them move around the deck, stretch their legs, relieve themselves over the side of the ship. Oluwale looked around at his fellow captives. He saw Abile, still alive despite his infected head wound. He saw Redoshi, the young girl, looking even smaller and more fragile than before. He saw Kupali, still rocking and singing to her invisible baby. He saw Gumpa, his friend from the barracoon, looking old and broken. And he saw one of the white sailors watching them, the young one with the kind face. Their eyes met, And Oluwale saw something there, guilt, maybe, or sympathy. The sailor looked away quickly, but not before Oluwale saw him wipe his eyes. After an hour, they were taken back below. But the next day, they were brought up again. And the day after that, it became a routine mornings in the hold. Afternoons on deck, nights back in the darkness. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was enough to keep them alive. Oluwale began to learn the rhythms of the ship. He learned to recognize the different sailors by their footsteps, their voices. He learned which ones were cruel and which ones were merely indifferent. And he learned about the young sailor, the one with the kind face. His name was Thomas. Oluwale heard the other sailors calling him that. Thomas was different from the others. He didn't look at the captives with disgust or indifference. He looked at them with sorrow and shame. And sometimes, when the other sailors weren't watching, he would do small kindnesses. One day, when Oluwale was on deck, Thomas approached him with a cup of water. Not the vinegar-treated water they usually got, but fresh water, clean and cool. He held it out, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. Oluwale took the cup and drank. The water was like a blessing, washing away the taste of vinegar and bile. He drank it all, then handed the cup back. "Thank you," he said in Yoruba. Thomas didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. He nodded, then hurried away before anyone could see. After that, Thomas found small ways to help. He would bring extra water, or a piece of fruit, or a rag to clean wounds. He would linger near Oluwale during the deck time, as if wanting to talk but not knowing how. Once, he tried to speak, gesturing and making sounds, trying to communicate. Oluwale realized the sailor was trying to learn his language. He began to teach him, pointing to things and saying the Yoruba words. Sky, water, ship, man. Thomas would repeat the words, his pronunciation terrible but his effort genuine. Over the weeks, they developed a strange kind of friendship. They couldn't really communicate, couldn't share their thoughts or feelings in any meaningful way, but there was an understanding between them, a recognition of shared humanity. Thomas was trapped too, Oluwale realized. Maybe not in chains, maybe not in the same way, but trapped nonetheless. Trapped by poverty or debt or circumstances that had forced him onto this ship, forced him to participate in this horror. One night, when Oluwale was below in the darkness, he heard footsteps on the ladder, then a voice, whispering in broken Yoruba, "Oluwale." It was Thomas. He'd come down into the hold, risking punishment, carrying a water skin. He made his way through the darkness to where Oluwale was chained, then pressed the water skin into his hands. "For you," Thomas whispered, "and others. Share." Oluwale took the water skin, overwhelmed by the gesture. "Why?" he asked. "Why help?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, in his broken Yoruba, he said, "Wrong. This is wrong. I am sorry." He left before Oluwale could respond, climbing back up the ladder and disappearing. Oluwale sat in the darkness, holding the water skin, feeling tears run down his face. It was such a small thing, such an inadequate gesture in the face of such enormous suffering. But it mattered. It mattered that someone saw them as human. It mattered that someone cared. He shared the water with those around him, passing the skin from person to person in the darkness. And as they drank, he told them about Thomas, about the young sailor who was trying to help, who was trying to be human in an inhuman situation. "There is still good in the world," he said. "Even here, even now, there is still good." He didn't know if he believed it, but he said it anyway, because they need to believe it, because without that belief, there was only despair, and despair would kill them faster than thirst or disease. Thomas came again the next night, and the night after that, always with water, sometimes with a piece of fruit or bread that he'd hidden in his shirt. He never stayed long, couldn't risk being caught, but his visits became something Oluwale looked forward to, a small light in the endless darkness. They developed a language between them, part Yoruba, part English, Part gesture and expression, Thomas taught Oluwale words. Sky, wind, home. Oluwale taught Thomas. Family, hope, freedom. They were inadequate translations, words that couldn't capture the full weight of meaning, but they tried. How long? Oluwale asked one night. How long until land? Thomas held up his fingers. 2 weeks. Maybe 3. 2 or 3 more weeks in this hell. Oluwale closed his eyes. Around him, people were coughing, moaning, crying out in their sleep. The smell was unbearable. Every day, someone died. Every day, the guards came down and dragged bodies up the ladder, throwing them overboard like refuse. I don't know if I can survive it, Oluwale whispered. Thomas reached through the darkness and gripped his shoulder. You will, he said. You are strong. I see it. After Thomas left, Oluwale sat in the darkness and thought about strength. He'd always thought of strength as something physical, the ability to work hard, to fight, to endure. But now he understood that there were other kinds of strength. The strength to hope when hope seemed foolish. The strength to care for others when you could barely care for yourself. The strength to remain human when everything around you was designed to strip away your humanity. He thought about his mother, about the stories she used to tell. Stories about ancestors who had survived impossible things. Stories about the resilience of their people, about how they had endured and adapted and survived through centuries of change and challenge. We are still here, he whispered to the darkness. We are still here. Around him, others took up the words, a whisper at first, then growing stronger. We are still here. We are still here. It became their prayer, their defiance, their promise to themselves and to each other. Whatever happened, whatever they faced in this new land they were being taken to, they would survive. They would remember. They would endure. The ship sailed on through the darkness, carrying its human cargo toward an uncertain future. Chapter 9. The water changed color as they approached the American coast. Foster noticed at first the deep blue of the open Atlantic, giving way to the greener hues of the continental shelf. They were 3 days out from Mobile, maybe less if the wind held. He hadn't slept properly in a week. Every sail on the horizon made his heart race. Every shift in the wind felt like a warning. The Clotilda was fast, but she was also distinctive, a schooner with her particular lines, her particular rigging. Anyone who knew ships would remember her, and there were men in Mobile who knew ships very well. Burns Miaher stood at the rail, scanning the horizon with a spyglass. He'd been doing that for hours, methodical and patient. Foster envied him that calm. Or maybe it wasn't calm at all. Maybe it was just a different kind of fear. Anything? Foster asked. Nothing yet. Burns lowered the glass. But we're in patrolled waters now. Revenue cutters? Navy ships? They'll be looking. I know what they'll be looking for. Then you know we need to be careful. Burns turned to face him. My brother's plan was to bring them in at night, through the back channels. Avoid the main shipping lanes entirely. I know the plan. Do you know the channels? Some of them are tricky. Shallow water, shifting sandbars. Foster felt his jaw tighten. I've been sailing these waters since before you were born. I'm not questioning your skill. I'm questioning your nerves. They stared at each other for a long moment. Finally, Foster looked away. My nerves are fine. Good. Because if we're caught now, after everything— Burns didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Foster knew what capture would mean. Prison, certainly. Possibly hanging. The federal government had made examples of slave traders before, and they'd do it again. Especially now, with tensions between North and South reaching a breaking point. A Northern judge would show no mercy to a Southern captain caught importing slaves. And beyond the legal consequences, there was something else. Something harder to name. If they were caught now, it would mean that all of this, the voyage, the suffering, the moral compromises, had been for nothing. The people in the hold below would be freed, yes, but they'd already been taken from their homes. already been traumatized, already been changed forever. Their freedom wouldn't undo what had been done to them. Better to finish it, Foster thought. Better to see it through. He didn't examine that logic too closely. "I'll get us in," he said. "You just make sure your brother has everything ready on shore." Burns nodded and went back to his vigil at the rail. Foster climbed down to check on the crew. They were nervous, too. He could see it. Men who'd been joking and laughing a week ago were now quiet, focused. They knew what was at stake. Thomas was at the helm, keeping the ship steady. The young man had proven himself during the voyage. He had good instincts, a steady hand. But his face was drawn, his eyes shadowed. The voyage had aged him. It had aged all of them. "How are they?" Foster asked, nodding toward the hold. "Quiet. Too quiet." Thomas glanced at him. "Some of them are very sick, Captain. I don't know if they'll make it." "They'll make it. We're almost there." "And then what? What happens to them then?" Foster felt something twist in his chest. "That's not our concern, isn't it?" Thomas's voice was soft, but there was an edge to it. "We brought them here. We're responsible. We're responsible for delivering them safely, that's all." Foster heard the harshness in his own voice and hated it. "After that, they're Mayor's problem." Thomas looked like he wanted to say more, but he held his tongue. "Smart boy. Learning when to keep quiet." Foster went to his cabin and pulled out his charts. He spread them across the table, studying the approaches to Mobile Bay. There were several ways in, but most of them were too exposed. The main channel was out of the question, too much traffic, too many eyes. But there were smaller channels, routes that local fishermen used. Narrow passages through the marshes and barrier islands. Dangerous, especially at night, but possible. He traced a route with his finger, memorizing every turn, every landmark. He'd sailed these waters 100 times, but never with cargo like this. Never with so much at stake. A knock at the door. "Captain?" It was one of the crew. "Ship on the horizon. Southeast." Foster's blood went cold. He grabbed his spyglass and went up on deck. There, a dark shape against the afternoon sky, hull down but visible. Too far to make out details, but the profile was wrong for a merchant vessel. "Revenue cutter," Burns said quietly. He'd already seen it. "Maybe. Or Navy." They watched in silence as the distant ship held its course. It wasn't heading toward them. Not yet. But it was there. A reminder that they were being hunted. "We need to change course," Burns said. "Head further east. Stay out of their patrol area. That'll add half a day to our voyage. Better than being caught." Foster knew he was right. He gave the order, and the Clotilda came about, heading away from the distant ship. They watched until it disappeared below the horizon. And even then, Foster couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, he ordered the lamps kept low. They sailed through darkness, guided by stars and Foster's memory of these waters. The crew was silent, every man aware that sound carried over water. In the hold, the captives sensed the change too. Oluwale felt it in his bones. They were close to land. The motion of the ship had changed, the rhythm of the waves different. And the crew was different too. Tense. Frightened, even. Something was happening. "We're near the end," he whispered to Gumpa. "I can feel it. The end of the voyage, maybe. But the beginning of something else." Oluwale knew he was right. Whatever awaited them in this new land, it wouldn't be freedom. They hadn't been stolen from their homes and carried across the ocean just to be set free. Around him, people were dying. Not many, most had survived the voyage, but some were too weak, too sick. An old woman had died 2 days ago, and they'd heard the splash as her body was thrown overboard. A young child had died yesterday. The mother's wails had echoed through the hold for hours. Oluwale himself felt weak. His body was wasted, his muscles atrophied from weeks of confinement. His skin was covered in sores from the chains and the filth. He could feel his ribs, count them with his fingers. But he was alive, and he was determined to stay that way. "When we reach land," he said to those around him. We must remember who we are. Remember our names, our families, our homes. They will try to make us forget. We must not let them. How do we resist? Someone asked. They have all the power. We resist by surviving, by remembering, by staying human. Oluwale's voice was stronger now. They can chain our bodies, but they cannot chain our spirits, not unless we let them. Reidoshi was nearby, holding her younger sister. The girl had survived the voyage, though she was thin and weak. Will we ever see home again? Reidoshi asked. Oluwale wanted to lie, to give her hope, but he couldn't. I don't know, but we will see tomorrow, and the day after that, and we will survive. The hatch opened, and Thomas climbed down with water. He moved quickly, quietly, distributing it among the captives. When he reached Oluwale, he paused. Tonight, he whispered. We arrive tonight. Oluwale nodded. He didn't know if that was good news or bad. Thomas hesitated, then said something in his own language. Oluwale didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. Apology? Regret? Shame? I know, Oluwale said in his own language. I know. Thomas climbed back up, and the hatch closed again. In the darkness, Oluwale felt the ship turning, the motion changing. They were entering shallower water. He could feel it. We are still here, he whispered. Around him, others took up the words, their prayer, their promise. We are still here. Foster guided the Clotilda through the darkness with a skill born of decades at sea. The entrance to Mobile Bay was ahead, marked by the lighthouse on Sand Island. But he wasn't heading for the main channel. Instead, he turned north, toward the marshes and the maze of small waterways that threaded through them. The water was black as ink. No moon tonight, he'd planned it that way. The Clotilda moved like a ghost, her sails barely visible against the night sky. Depth? He called softly. 3 fathoms, came the reply. Shoaling. They were in the shallows now, threading between sandbars that could rip the bottom out of the ship if he miscalculated. Foster's hands were steady on the wheel, but his heart was racing. This was it, the final threshold. Once they crossed into the bay, there would be no turning back. The crime would be complete. He would be a slave trader, not just in deed, but in fact. A smuggler who had successfully imported human cargo into the United States in defiance of federal law. He thought about his wife, about his children. What would they think if they knew? What would they say? He pushed the thoughts away. Too late for that now. Light ahead, Burns said. Starboard side. Foster saw at a lantern, moving along the shore. The signal. Timothy Meaher and his men, waiting to receive the cargo. Bring her in slow, Foster ordered. Nice and quiet. The Clotilda glided through the dark water, her keel barely clearing the bottom. Foster could see the shoreline now, the dark mass of trees against the slightly lighter sky. The lantern moved again, guiding them to a small inlet. They dropped anchor in shallow water, close enough to shore that they could wade in. The crew moved quickly, efficiently, preparing to unload their cargo. Foster stood at the rail and looked back toward the open water. No lights, no ships. They'd made it. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt something else. Something cold and heavy in his chest. Captain? Thomas was beside him. Are you all right? Fine. Foster's voice was rough. Get ready to bring them up. Thomas hesitated. Sir, Just do it. The young man went below. Foster heard the sounds of chains being unlocked, people being moved, voices in a language he didn't understand. Frightened and confused, Burns appeared at his side. My brother's waiting. We need to move fast, get them ashore before dawn. I know. You did it, Foster. You actually did it. Foster didn't answer. He watched as the first of the captives emerged from the hold, blinking in the darkness, their chains rattling. They looked like ghosts, like shadows of human beings, thin, weak, traumatized. He'd done this to them. He and the mayors and everyone else involved in this venture. They'd stolen these people from their homes, transported them across an ocean, and now they were about to sell them into slavery. And he'd done it for money, to pay his debts. The cold thing in his chest grew heavier. "Let's get this done," he said. The Clotilda had reached Mobile Bay. The voyage was over. But for the people in chains, another kind of journey was just beginning. Part 4, Alabama. Chapter 10. The ground didn't move. That was the first thing Oluwale noticed when they pushed him off the small boat onto the shore. Solid ground, earth that stayed still beneath his feet. After weeks of the ship's constant motion, it felt wrong, unnatural. He stumbled, his legs weak and uncertain. Around him, others were doing the same, falling, catching themselves, trying to stand on legs that had forgotten how to walk on land. The chains made it harder. Everything made it harder. The air smelled different here. Not the salt and rot of the ship, but something else. Trees, earth, growing things. It reminded him of home, and the reminder was a knife in his chest. "Move them inland," someone said in the harsh language. "Away from the water." Hands pushed at Oluwale's back. He walked, stumbling in the darkness. Around him, he could hear the others breathing, crying, praying. Gumpa was somewhere behind him. Redoshi was ahead, he thought, though in the darkness it was hard to tell. "Abile?" he called softly. "Here," his friend's voice, weak but alive. "I'm here." The ground beneath their feet changed from sand to grass to something harder. They were being herded like animals, pushed and prodded in a direction they couldn't see. Oluwale's eyes were adjusting to the darkness, and he could make out shapes now. Trees, buildings, and men, white men, standing and watching. One of them stepped forward. Even in the darkness, Oluwale could see he was different from the sailors. Better dressed, more confident. This was a man who owned things, who was used to being obeyed. "How many?" the man asked. 110, Burns replied. "We lost a few on the voyage, but most survived." "Good, good." The man walked closer, looking at the captives the way Oluwale had seen men look at cattle in the market. Assessing, calculating. "They look weak. They'll recover. A few weeks of decent food and rest. They'll be strong enough to work." "They'd better be. I've got buyers waiting, but they won't pay premium prices for half-dead Africans." Oluwale didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. They were being discussed like goods, like property. The realization settled over him like a weight. This was what they were now. Not people, property. Foster stood apart from the others, watching. Timothy Meaher was inspecting the captives, making notes in a small book by lantern light, counting his investment, calculating his profit. "You'll have your money by the end of the week," Timothy said without looking up. "Once I've dispersed them and collected from the buyers, I want it sooner." "End of the week, Foster." That was the agreement. Timothy closed his book and looked at him. "You did well. Better than I expected, honestly. Clean voyage, no interference, good survival rate. You should be proud." Proud, Foster almost laughed. "I just want to be done with this." "You are done. Your part, anyway." Timothy gestured to the captives. "Now comes the tricky part, getting them distributed without attracting attention. I've got wagons waiting, different locations lined up. We'll split them into small groups, move them separately. By tomorrow night, they'll be scattered across 3 counties. And the ship? Burn it. Tonight, before dawn. Can't risk anyone finding it." Foster felt something twist in his chest. The Clotilda, his beautiful ship, the finest he'd ever built, reduced to ashes to hide their crime. "I'll take care of it," he said quietly. "Good man." Timothy clapped him on the shoulder. "In a few months, this'll all be forgotten. Just another business transaction. You'll see." But Foster knew he wouldn't forget. He'd remember this night for the rest of his life. The faces of the people he'd stolen, the chains, the fear in their eyes. He'd remember, and he'd have to live with it. "Start loading them," Timothy called to his men. "Group of 20 in each wagon. Keep them quiet. If anyone asks, they're field hands from Georgia. Understand?" The men moved forward, beginning to separate the captives. Oluwale felt hands on his arms, pulling him in one direction. He resisted, trying to see where they were taking the others. "Gampa," he called. "Redushi." "Oluwale," Gampa's voice, somewhere in the darkness. "Brother, keep them together," someone shouted in the harsh language. "Families together, it keeps them calmer." But they weren't keeping them together. Oluwale could see now, could see the captives being divided, pulled apart. A woman was screaming, reaching for a child being taken in a different direction. Men were being separated from their wives, friends from friends. "Abile," Oluwale shouted. "Where are you?" "Here. I'm—" His friend's voice was cut off as he was pushed toward a different wagon. Oluwale tried to move toward him, but the chains held him back. Hands gripped his arms, stronger than he was in his weakened state. He was being pulled toward a wagon, away from his friends, away from everyone he knew. "No," he said in his own language. "No, please, don't separate us." But they didn't understand, or they didn't care. He was lifted, pushed into the back of a wagon with others he didn't know. The wooden floor was rough beneath him. Around him, people were crying, calling out names. Through the crowd, he caught one last glimpse of Gampa being loaded into a different wagon. Their eyes met across the distance. Gampa raised his hand, just slightly, a gesture of farewell or solidarity or hope. Then the wagon began to move, and Gampa disappeared into the darkness. Oluwale pressed his face against the wooden slats, trying to see out. Behind them, the ship sat in the water, dark and silent. The place where they'd suffered, where some had died, where all of them had lost their freedom. He thought about his village, about his mother and sister. He thought about the life he'd had, the future he'd imagined. All of it was gone now, as distant as the stars. The wagon rolled on through the darkness, carrying him toward a future he couldn't imagine, in a land he didn't know, among people whose language he didn't speak. He was alone, and he didn't know if he'd ever see his friends again. Behind them, on the shore, Foster watched the wagons disappear into the night. Thomas stood beside him, silent. "We should burn the ship," Thomas said finally. "I know." "Sir, Thomas stopped, struggling with words. "I'm sorry. For my part in this. I'm sorry." Foster looked at the young man. He wanted to say something, to offer some wisdom or comfort or explanation, but there was nothing to say. They'd done what they'd done. Sorry, didn't change it. "Help me gather the materials," he said instead. "Let's get this over with." They worked in silence, piling kindling and oil-soaked rags throughout the Clotilda. Foster moved through the ship one last time, touching the wood he'd shaped with his own hands, remembering when she'd been new and clean and full of promise. Now she would burn. Evidence destroyed. Crime hidden. When everything was ready, Foster struck the match. The flames caught quickly, spreading through the ship with hungry efficiency. Within minutes, the Clotilda was ablaze, fire reaching toward the sky, smoke billowing into the darkness. Foster and Thomas stood on the shore and watched her burn. "What do we do now?" Thomas asked. "We go home," Foster said. "We go back to our lives. We pretend this never happened. Can we do that? Can we just forget?" Foster watched the flames consume his ship, watched the mast collapse in a shower of sparks. He thought about the people in the wagons being carried away to lives of slavery. He thought about the young man who'd looked at him with such intensity, who'd spoken words Foster couldn't understand but whose meaning was clear. "I will remember you." "No," Foster said quietly. "We can't forget, but we can try." The Clotilda burned through the night. By dawn, there was nothing left but charred timbers and ash, sinking slowly into the muddy waters of the bay. The ship was gone. but the consequences of what they'd done would last for generations. Chapter 11. The wagon stopped at dawn. Oluwale had dozed fitfully during the journey, his body exhausted but his mind refusing rest. Now, as rough hands pulled him from the wagon bed, he stumbled on legs that barely remembered how to stand. Around him, others from the ship were being unloaded, he counted 12, maybe 15. Not Abil, not Gumpa, different faces, though all marked by the same hollow-eyed exhaustion. The place they'd been brought to was unlike anything Oluwale had seen. Fields stretched in every direction, planted with a crop he didn't recognize, tall plants with broad leaves arranged in endless rows. The air was thick with humidity, different from the coastal heat of home. Insects buzzed in clouds. And everywhere, the smell of earth and growing things and something else. Something he would later learn was the particular scent of cotton. A white man on horseback surveyed them with the same assessing look the captain had used. He said something in that harsh language, then rode away. They stood there, swaying with fatigue, until other people approached. Black people, but different from anyone Oluwale had known. They wore strange clothes, rough fabric, shapeless and worn. They spoke that same harsh language, though their voices carried different rhythms, different music underneath the foreign words. An older woman stepped forward. She looked at the new arrivals with an expression Oluwale couldn't quite read: pity, perhaps, mixed with something harder. She spoke in the white man's language, then seemed to realize they didn't understand. She tried again, slower, with gestures. One of the men with her, younger, with graying hair and careful eyes, stepped closer to Oluwale. He spoke, and Oluwale's heart nearly stopped. The words were wrong, the accent strange, but underneath was something familiar. A language from the coast, not his own but close enough that he could grasp fragments of meaning. "You understand?" the man asked haltingly, as if the words were rusty from disuse. "Yes," Oluwale said, his voice cracking. "Yes, I understand some." The man's face softened. "My name. They call me Jim here. I was taken when I was young, very young, from near the coast." He paused, searching for words. "This place. This is slavery. You understand slavery?" "We had slaves in my village," Oluwale said. "Prisoners of war. But they could. Not like that," Jim interrupted. "Not like that at all." He glanced over his shoulder at the white man on horseback, now distant but still visible. "Here, you are property. Like a cow. Like a tool. You understand?" Oluwale felt the ground shift beneath him again, though it was solid earth. "For how long?" Jim's face answered before his words did. "Forever. Your children too. And their children." The words made no sense. Slavery in his village was temporary, a few years of service, then freedom. This was something else entirely, something his mind couldn't quite grasp. "I don't understand," Oluwale said. "You will," Jim said quietly. "Come, I'll show you where you sleep, where you work, the rules." He paused. "There are many rules. Break them, and—" He didn't finish, but his meaning was clear. They were led to a row of rough wooden structures, cabins, Jim called them, though they were unlike any dwelling Oluwale had known. Inside, the space was dim and cramped, with rough pallets on the floor and little else. The smell of too many bodies in too small a space hung in the air. "You sleep here," Jim said, gesturing to an empty pallet. "Work starts at first light. You'll pick cotton, I'll show you how. You work until dark. Sometimes longer." He pointed to a bell mounted on a post outside. "That bell tells you when to start, when to eat, when to stop. You obey the bell. You obey the overseer, the white man on the horse. You obey the master when he comes. You don't run. You don't fight. You don't talk back." "And if we do?" Oluwale asked. Jim pulled up his shirt. His back was a map of scars, some old and faded, some newer. "This?" he said simply. The other new arrivals were being given similar instructions by other enslaved people. though without the benefit of shared language. Oluwale watched a young woman trying to understand through gestures and tone, her face showing the same confusion and horror he felt. "The others from the ship," Oluwale said. "Do you know where they were taken?" Jim shook his head. "Different places. The white men who bought you, they're brothers. They have different properties. Some of your people are probably nearby. Some farther away." He paused. "Some were sold to other men entirely. You might never see them again." Never. That word again. Oluwale thought of Abile, of Goompa, of all the others, scattered like seeds in the wind. "I need to learn the language," Oluwale said. "The white man's language. Will you teach me?" Jim looked at him with something like respect. "Yes, but carefully. They don't like us to read or write. Speaking is allowed, they need us to understand orders. But learning too much," he shrugged. "Dangerous." Over the next days, Oluwale learned the rhythms of this new life. The bell at dawn, jolting him from dreams of home. The fields, stretching endlessly. The cotton plants scratching his hands as he learned to pick the white bolls without damaging them. The overseer on his horse, watching, always watching. The sun beating down, different from home but just as merciless. The ache in his back, his hands, his legs, the meager food, cornmeal and salt pork, nothing like the rich stews and yams of his village. The exhaustion that went bone deep. And the language, he absorbed it desperately, learning words from Jim, from the other enslaved people, even from the overseer's barked commands. Faster, here, stop, work. Each word was a tool, a weapon, a key to understanding this incomprehensible world. The other enslaved people watched the new arrivals with mixed feelings. Some were kind, like Jim, helping them learn, sharing extra food when they could. Others were resentful, more mouths to feed, more bodies competing for the limited resources and small mercies. And some were simply curious, asking questions through Jim about Africa, about their villages, about a world they'd never seen. "My grandmother was from Africa," one young woman said through Jim's translation. "She told stories, but she died when I was small. I don't remember much." Oluwale found himself telling stories in the evenings, when the work was done and they gathered in the cabins. Jim translated, and others listened stories of his village, of the festivals, of the gods and ancestors. He sang songs, teaching them the melodies even if they couldn't understand the words. "Why do you do this?" Jim asked one night. "Why hold on to these things?" "Because they can take everything else," Oluwale said. "But they cannot take who I am, who we are. As long as I remember, as long as I tell the stories, my people are not gone." Jim was quiet for a long moment. "I wish I remembered more," he said finally. "I was so young when they took me. Sometimes I dream in a language I don't understand anymore. Sometimes I hear my mother's voice, but I can't remember her face." "Then I will remember for both of us," Oluwale said. On the 5th day, working in a field near the property's edge, Oluwale heard a voice singing. The melody was familiar, a song from the ship, one of the songs they'd sung in the darkness of the hold. His heart leaped. He looked around and saw, in the adjacent field, a group of workers, and among them he recognized faces. Not Abele or Gumpa, but others from the ship. They were close. Not together, but close enough to hear each other's voices. That night, he sang louder, and from the distance, he heard answering songs. They were scattered, but not lost. Not entirely. "You're smiling," Jim observed. "Some of my people are nearby," Oluwale said. "I heard them today." "Be careful," Jim warned. "The masters don't like us visiting between properties, don't like us gathering in groups. They're afraid of what might happen if we organize." "Afraid of slaves?" Oluwale asked. "Afraid of people," Jim corrected. "That's why they work so hard to make us forget we're people, to make us forget we were ever anything else." Oluwale looked at his hands, raw and bleeding from the cotton. He thought about the chains, the ship, the separation from everything he'd known. He thought about the word Jim had used, forever. But he also thought about the songs carrying across the fields, about the stories he told in the evenings, about the way the others leaned in to listen, hungry for connection, for meaning, for something beyond the endless labor. They can try, Oluwale said quietly. But I will not forget. We will not forget. Jim smiled, sad and knowing. Then you're stronger than most. Hold on to that. You'll need it. That night, lying on his rough pallet, Oluwale whispered the names of his family members, his friends, his village. He recited the lineage of his ancestors, going back as far as he could remember. He sang softly the songs his mother had taught him. He was Oluwale, son of Bante, and no matter what they called him here, no matter what they tried to make him, that truth remained. In the darkness, others whispered their own names, their own stories, the new arrivals and the old, connecting across the gulf of language and experience, finding common ground in their shared humanity. Outside, the night insects sang, the cotton plants rustled in the breeze, and somewhere in the distance, a bell waited to ring at dawn, to call them back to labor. But for now, in this moment, they were not just slaves. They were people, with names and histories and memories that no one could take away. As long as they remembered, they were not defeated. As long as they remembered, there was hope. Epilogue. Africatown, Alabama, 1935. The rumors about the Clotilda had circulated for years after the war. Federal investigators came, asked questions, examined records. William Foster and Timothy Meaher denied everything, and no proof could be found the ship had burned too thoroughly. The witnesses were formerly enslaved people whose testimony carried little weight in Southern courts. The Meahers grew wealthy from timber and shipbuilding, their names gracing streets and buildings throughout Mobile. Foster lived quietly until his death, his conscience his only judge. But in Africatown, the story lived. Oluwale, known in his later years as Cudjo Lewis, sat on his porch at 94 years old, his great-grandchildren playing in the yard. The girl, Mary, climbed into his lap with the fearlessness of the very young. "Tell about the ship, great-grandpa," she said. "Tell about Africa." And he did. He told about Bante, about his mother's compound, about the morning the warriors came. He told about the barracoon, the ship, the terrible crossing. He spoke in English now, though Yoruba words still flavored his speech, and his children and grandchildren understood both. "Why you always tell the sad parts?" Mary asked. Oluwale looked around at Africatown, at the houses built by free hands, at the church where they sang the old songs, at the children who carried African names alongside American ones. He thought of Abil, gone now 10 years, of Kupoli, who'd lived to see her own great-grandchildren, of all those who'd survived and built something lasting from the ashes of their stolen lives. "Because the sad parts make the strong parts mean something," he said. "We were stolen. We survived. We built this place with our own hands, kept our own ways. That's not a sad story, child. That's a victory." The Meahers had their wealth, their prominence, their streets and buildings, but the survivors of the Clotilda had something more enduring. A community that remembered, that preserved, that transformed horror into heritage. They had won not through justice that had been denied them, but through persistence, through the simple, profound act of refusing to be erased. "Tell me the names again," Mary said. "All the names from Africa." And Oluwale did, his voice strong despite his years, passing the story to another generation. As long as someone remembered, as long as someone spoke the names, they had not been defeated. The last ship had brought them in chains, but they had built Africatown in freedom, and no one could take that away. Chapter 13, 5 years after freedom, 1870. The land north of Mobile was swampy and difficult, which was precisely why they could afford it. Pooling their meager savings, working extra jobs, The survivors of the Clotilda and their families purchased several acres where the railroad tracks cut through the marsh. White folks didn't want it. That made it perfect. Oluwale stood with Abile and Kupali, surveying the plot they'd claimed. His friend had survived, though he walked with a limp now from an injury that had never properly healed. Kupali had grown into a strong young woman, married to one of the other survivors, her baby strapped to her back in the traditional way. "It's not much," Abile said. "It's ours," Oluwale replied. "That makes it everything." They built slowly, carefully. Houses raised on stilts against the flooding, constructed with whatever materials they could afford or salvage. Oluwale's hands, which had once carved masks and told stories through wood, learned new skills: carpentry, masonry, the practical arts of survival. His wife, Sarah, a woman born into slavery in Alabama who'd joined their community, worked beside him, her strength matching his own. Their daughter, whom they'd named Adisa after his mother, played in the dirt while they worked, chattering in a mixture of English and Yoruba. "Tell me about the ocean," she would say, and Oluwale would pause in his labor to speak of Bante, of the village he'd lost, of the journey that had brought him here. He told her everything, even the hard parts, especially the hard parts. She needed to know. The church came first, before many of the houses were finished. They built it together, all of them, and on the first Sunday they gathered there, Oluwale stood before his people and spoke in Yoruba, then English, then the other languages of their homeland. "We are here," he said. "We survived, and we will not forget." In the evenings, the elders taught the children the old ways: songs and stories, proverbs and traditions. The children born in freedom learned the languages of their parents' homelands, learned the names of ancestors they would never meet, learned about a ship called the Clotilda and the crime that had brought their families to this place. "Why do we have to remember the sad things?" Adisa asked one night. Oluwale knelt beside his daughter, touching her face gently. "Because forgetting would dishonor those who didn't survive to see this. Your grandmother Adisa, my friend Gumpa, so many others. We remember for them. We remember so it never happens again." The community grew. Gardens flourished in the rich soil. A school was established. They governed themselves, settled disputes in the traditional ways, maintained the customs that slavery had tried to erase. When white officials came with their laws and their taxes, the people of Africatown stood together, speaking in their own languages first, English only when necessary. Oluwale became a leader, though he'd never sought the role. People came to him for wisdom, for judgment, for stories. He was a bridge between the old world and the new, between the horror of the past and the possibility of the future. On the 5th anniversary of their freedom, they held a ceremony. Oluwale stood before the community, now numbering over 100 souls, and poured libations for the ancestors. He spoke the names of those who died on the ship, in the barracoon, in the years of slavery. He spoke the names of the villages they'd come from, the families they'd lost. "We are still here," he said, his voice strong despite his years. "We built this. We created something that is ours. They tried to break us, but we would not break. They tried to make us forget, but we remembered." He looked at the children, at Adisa and the others, born in freedom, or nearly so. "This is your inheritance. Not just this land, but the knowledge of who you are, where you came from, what your people survived." That night, as the community celebrated with food and music and dancing, Oluwale stood at the edge of the gathering with Abile. They were older now, marked by the years and the hardships, but they had endured. "Do you think about Bante?" Abile asked. "Every day," Oluwale said. "But this is home now, too. We made it home." In the distance, children laughed, playing games their parents had taught them from across the ocean. The smell of cooking fires mixed with the scent of the marsh. Somewhere, someone was singing in Yoruba, and others joined in, their voices rising into the Alabama night. They had been stolen, transported, enslaved. They had lost everything. And yet, they had built this. A community, a home, a future. Africa Town stood as testament to their resilience, their refusal to be erased. It would stand for generations, a living memorial to those who'd survived the last slave ship and to all those who hadn't lived to see freedom. As long as Africa Town existed, as long as the stories were told and the languages spoken and the traditions maintained, they would not be forgotten. They had won, in the end. Not the victory they'd wanted, nothing could give them back what had been taken, but a victory nonetheless. They had survived. They had remembered. They had built something lasting. And that, Oluwale thought as he watched his daughter dance with the other children, was enough. Chapter 12. 5 years later. Spring 1865. The rumors came in whispers, carried by field hands who'd heard from house servants who'd overheard their masters talking in worried tones. A war. A president named Lincoln. Something about freedom. Oluwale, now fluent in English, though he still spoke his native tongue whenever he could, listened carefully to every scrap of news. The plantation had changed during the war years. Fewer white overseers, less food. The master's sons had gone to fight, and one had not returned. There was a brittleness to everything now, like glass about to shatter. "They say the Union Army is coming," Jim told him one evening. "They say Lincoln freed us. 2 years ago. Maybe more. Then why are we still here?" Oluwale asked. Jim shrugged. "Because nobody told the masters. Or they don't care what Lincoln says. Or they're waiting to see who wins." But the waiting ended on a humid April morning, when a man in a blue uniform rode up to the plantation with papers in his hand. Oluwale was in the fields when he heard the shouting. He straightened, his back aching from the morning's labor, and saw people running toward the main house. He dropped his hoe and followed. The man in blue was reading from a document, his voice carrying across the yard. "All persons held as slaves within said designated states and parts of states are, and henceforward shall be free." Free! The word hung in the air like something physical, something you could reach out and touch. Around him, people were crying. Some were laughing. Some stood frozen, as if afraid to believe it. An old woman fell to her knees, hands raised to the sky, praising God in a voice cracked with emotion. Oluwale felt tears on his face and didn't wipe them away. 5 years. 5 years of labor and loss and holding on to hope by the thinnest of threads. And now this. "We're free," someone said beside him. "Lord have mercy, we're free." But freedom brought questions. The Union soldier rode away, and they were left standing in the yard, looking at each other with a mixture of joy and confusion. Free to do what? Free to go where? Most had no money, no possessions beyond the clothes on their backs. "I'm going to find my sister," one woman announced. "She was sold to a plantation in Georgia. I'm going to walk there if I have to." Others nodded, making their own plans. But Oluwale's thoughts went immediately to his friends from the ship. Abile, Gampa, Redoshi, the others who'd survived the crossing. They'd been scattered across different plantations, different owners. Were they alive? Were they free, too? "I need to find my people," he said to Jim. "The ones from the ship." "The Clotilda people?" Jim nodded slowly. "I heard some of them ended up at the Mayaher plantation. Some at other places nearby. If you're going to look, start there." It took 3 weeks of walking, asking questions, following leads. But slowly, impossibly, they found each other. Abili was thinner, scarred from a whipping that had nearly killed him, but alive. Gampa had lost an eye but still had his fierce spirit. Redoshi wept when she saw Oluwale, and they held each other like the siblings they'd become. Others came too. Kupoli, who'd been just a girl on the ship and was now a young woman. Kupoli, who'd kept his humor even through the darkest times. Osa Kibi, who'd been a warrior in Bante and still carried himself like one. They gathered in a clearing near the river, 32 survivors of the Clotilda, and looked at each other with wonder. They'd survived. Against all odds, they'd survived. "What do we do now?" Radoshi asked. "Do we try to go home? Back to Africa?" The question hung heavy. Home. The word meant something different now. Their villages were gone, destroyed, or changed beyond recognition. Their families were dead or scattered. And they had no money for passage. No way to cross that vast ocean again. "I don't know if I could survive that journey again," Gumpa said quietly. "The ship, the water, I still dream about it." Others nodded. The Middle Passage had marked them all. "But we can't stay here," someone said. "Not on these plantations, not working for the people who enslaved us." Oluwale looked around at his friends, his family forged in suffering. An idea was forming, something that felt both impossible and necessary. "What if we stayed together?" he said slowly. "What if we found land of our own, built our own community? We can't go back to Bante, but we could build something new, something that honors where we came from." "Our own town?" Abile's eyes widened. "Is that possible?" "I don't know," Oluwale admitted. "But we're free now. We can try." They talked long into the night, planning and dreaming. They would pool their resources, find land they could afford, build houses and plant crops. They would speak their own language, practice their own customs, raise their children with the stories of Bante and the other places they'd come from. They would call it Africa Town. As the sun rose over the river, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Oluwale felt something he hadn't felt in 5 years. Not just hope, but certainty. They would survive this too. They would build something lasting. "We will remember," he said, and the others echoed him. "We will remember, and we will endure." The journey wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But for the first time since that terrible day in Bante, Oluwale could see a future that belonged to them, and it was enough. I hope you liked the story of the Clotilda. Be sure to like and subscribe to Sko's Media YouTube channel for more stories by Sylvester Sko Fourroux.